To the world, he was the untouchable symbol of American strength, the cowboy who never backed down, and the hero who always stood firm. But 47 years after his death, the truth about John Wayne has finally broken. Decades of silence revealing the dark secrets that destroyed him. And when you hear what really happened behind the legend, you will never look at John Wayne the same way again. Throughout his career, John Wayne was known as the Duke, a symbol of strength and masculinity. However, that nickname did not originate from films or any media strategy. It stemmed from his very ordinary childhood when Wayne was inseparable from his Airedale Duke. They were so close that neighbors called the pair Big Duke and Little Duke. That nickname followed Wayne throughout his life like a simple trace left behind by the boy Marion Morrison before he became a legend. Many believe Wayne turned to cinema out of passion, but the truth is, he had once staked his entire future on American football. With a scholarship at USC, Wayne had the opportunity to become a professional athlete. A surfing accident in 1926 destroyed that plan. The injury forced him to drop out of school, ending his sporting dreams and pushing him onto a path he had never chosen before. John Wayne did not enter Hollywood as a discovered star. He started by carrying props, cleaning sets, and playing nameless extras. For over a decade, Wayne existed on the fringes of the film industry. His later rise to icon status only highlights the vast gap between his humble beginnings and his subsequent glory. His birth name, Marion Morrison, was deemed too soft for the image of an American cowboy. Thus, the name John Wayne was born as a carefully calculated product. It did not reflect his true self, but rather what Hollywood needed, a strong, simple name that could easily become legendary. From this point on, the boundary between his real self and his constructed image began to take shape. Most of the money was left to his children, and he established a distribution system to determine the amount and timing of their payments. According to the terms he set, Michael, his eldest son at the time, would receive an additional $115,000 into his bank account. The handling of the remainder of the estate is not entirely clear. Most of the assets and real estate were handed over to the estate administrators, Mr. Warren, Mr. Johnson, and Michael, who was also a member of the management team. However, between then and now, an issue has arisen, namely a dispute over the actual value of each asset and ownership rights. The problem arose when one of Wayne's daughters decided she wanted to sell her share of the estate. The only person actually excluded from the will was the husband of his eldest daughter, for reasons that were never made clear. Not only was he excluded from the will, but he was also targeted to be denied his daughter's inheritance in the event of her death. Outside of the immediate family, two people who received a share of his money were his secretaries. They were Mary St. John and Pat Stacy, the former being his secretary and the latter being his secretary before his death. The two secretaries received a total of $40,000. Even by today's standards, that is a considerable sum, let alone at that time when it was probably considered a small fortune. His first marriage to Josephine Saenz began in 1933, when Wayne was not yet a legend. They had 4 children together, but just as his career took off, the family began to fall apart. Wayne was constantly away from home due to filming, while Josephine had to shoulder the responsibility of raising the children and maintaining the family life on her own. The distance between them grew, and his extramarital affair with Marlene Dietrich became the last straw. What is less often mentioned is that Dietrich was not only attracted to Wayne, but also saw him as a project to conquer. While Wayne, for the first time in his life, felt he was being seen as a person rather than an icon. His second marriage to Esperanza Bauer did not bring healing. On the contrary, it exposed Wayne's weakest side. Esperanza was extremely jealous, while Wayne increasingly turned to alcohol as a way to escape the pressure of always having to be John Wayne. The violent arguments, even to the point where Esperanza once fired a gun in the bedroom when Wayne was not home, are rarely mentioned because they completely shattered the image of the man who controlled everything. The marriage ended not because they fell out of love, but because neither could live in the shadow of such immense fame. His third wife, Pilar Pallet, brought Wayne a greater sense of stability, and they had 3 more children. But even this longest marriage did not escape the common fate. Wayne remained a man who lived more for his public image than for his private life. After separating, he never remarried. In his final years, Wayne lived with his secretary Pat Stacy in a quiet, uncomplicated relationship away from the spotlight. Perhaps only then did he get to live like a normal man without having to play a role. Despite starring in many war films, Wayne never saw combat. He was exempted from military service due to family circumstances and changes in conscription laws. Wayne believed he served his country better on screen, but that choice drew heavy criticism and left a blemish on his patriotic reputation. Wayne's use of a wig was not something he hid. Premature hair loss meant he had to maintain a familiar appearance for his audience. The wig became part of his image, demonstrating the strict control over his public persona that he and Hollywood imposed on him. John Wayne's cancer story is often told as a personal tragedy, but the truth is even more brutal. In 1954, while filming The Conqueror in Utah, Wayne and the entire film crew were assured that they were completely safe, even though the area was only about 160 kilometers from the Nevada nuclear test site. What few people knew was that Wayne was deeply concerned when he saw the radiation detectors beeping constantly on set. He joked that they must be broken, but in reality it was a reflexive attempt to reassure himself in the face of a fear that no one dared to name. 10 years later, Wayne was diagnosed with lung cancer. Doctors had to remove an entire lung and several ribs. After the surgery, Wayne was no longer the man who strode confidently as before. He had to learn to breathe again, to speak again, and to hide his physical pain behind his familiar smile. What was never spoken of much was Wayne's extreme fear of the public seeing him as weak, because if John Wayne fell, the image that the whole of America clung to would also be shaken. The tragedy deepened when his sons Michael and Patrick, who had also been on the set of The Conqueror, were diagnosed with cancer. Although they survived, Wayne never escaped the feeling of guilt. He once told his loved ones that if he had known this would happen, he would never have taken the role. By 1979, when his stomach cancer returned, Wayne understood that this time he would not win. His loved ones recounted that he was frighteningly calm, not because he was brave, but because he was too exhausted. John Wayne died not only from illness, but also from a series of decisions made in an era when people believed fame was more important than safety, and truth could be sacrificed for glory. His death not only ended the life of a star, but also exposed the harsh price Hollywood was willing to pay with the very people it created as legends. In 1954, The Conqueror was promoted as a grand project, bringing together the biggest names in Hollywood. John Wayne played Genghis Khan, Susan Hayward was the leading lady, and Dick Powell was the director. No one on set thought they were standing at the center of an invisible disaster. The Utah desert was chosen as the filming location for its majestic scenery, but few noticed that it was only about 160 kilometers from the Nevada nuclear test site, where atomic bomb tests had taken place not long before. What is rarely mentioned is that warning signs appeared very early on. Many crew members recalled that the radiation detectors on set beeped constantly. Sand clung to clothing, hair, and filming equipment. The dry, hot air caused people to breathe more deeply than usual, inadvertently drawing radioactive dust into their lungs. However, in the context of the Cold War, the authorities reassured everyone that the area was completely safe, and Hollywood, accustomed to trusting government assurances, chose to continue filming. One detail that was almost buried sand from Utah was also transported to Hollywood for additional filming in closed studios. This meant that radiation was not only present in the desert, but also followed the film crew back to Los Angeles, covering long working days in enclosed spaces where no one could avoid repeated exposure. The consequences were not immediate. It took years, even more than a decade, for cancer diagnoses to begin appearing. Initially, there were a few isolated cases, which gradually became a frighteningly long series. By the early 1980s, approximately 91 of the 220 crew members had developed cancer, and at least 46 had died. John Wayne, Susan Hayward, and Dick Powell. The names at the top of the billboards did not escape that fate. But behind them were dozens of cameramen, technicians, assistant directors, supporting actors, people without monuments, without memoirists, and with no one to tell their stories. The greatest tragedy lies in the fact that none of them were given the right to choose. They were unaware of the dangers they faced. There were no warnings, no protective equipment, and no transparent information. All were sacrificed for a film that would later be deemed an artistic failure. These people traded their health and lives for a work that film history does not even honor appropriately. Hollywood remained largely silent. There was no major investigation, no official apology, and no clear accountability. The Conqueror disaster was obscured by the glamour of big names, and by an era when the truth about radiation was still downplayed. It wasn't until years later, when the concept of downwinders was recognized, that people began piecing the fragments together. By then, most of the victims were no longer alive to hear the explanation. The Conqueror is not just a film. It is a testament to the price humanity pays when fame, power, and haste override safety and humanity. And it is precisely that decades-long silence that makes this disaster most terrifying, for it shows that some deaths require no clear perpetrator, only prolonged indifference. In 1976, The Shootist was released and immediately recognized as John Wayne's final Western. But what few realized at the time was that this film was not merely a cinematic work. It was a quiet confession, disguised by the role. Wayne played J.B. Brooks, an aging gunslinger living in a world that no longer had a place for people like him. From the very first frames, the character appears, with a heavy gait, rapid breathing, and soft groans when standing up or sitting down. This was not exaggerated acting. It was Wayne's real body speaking. What is rarely mentioned is that Wayne actively chose this script. He knew the audience was seeing his old age, and instead of hiding it, he decided to face it head-on. The character J.B. Brooks is diagnosed with cancer, a detail that shocks the audience because it is so similar to Wayne's real life, even though his illness was in remission at the time. Wayne didn't need to play a dying man. He just needed to be himself, bringing all his memories of illness, pain, and fear into every glance. During filming, Wayne was much weaker than the public was accustomed to seeing. There were days when he had to rest for hours between scenes due to exhaustion, and at times, he was hospitalized with severe flu. Nevertheless, he was determined not to let the film crew stop. A little-known detail is that Wayne requested that moments showing his character's exhaustion not be cut. He wanted the audience to see his frailty as an acknowledgement that even John Wayne could not escape the passage of time. The climactic scene where J.B. Brooks chooses death in a shootout, rather than lying in a hospital bed, is often seen as a quintessentially cowboy decision. But on a deeper level, it was Wayne's own choice. He did not want to be remembered as someone wasting away in a hospital. He wanted to depart actively, standing tall, not begging fate. It was not a glorification of violence, but a desire to control the final moments of his life. Lauren Bacall once recounted that the atmosphere on the set of The Shootist was unlike any film she had ever worked on. Everyone felt they were witnessing something final, though no one dared say it aloud. Ron Howard, who was very young at the time, recalled that Wayne treated him as if he were passing on a legacy not of guns, but of attitude towards life. After The Shootist, Wayne still planned to make a lighter film, as if to prove he wasn't ready to leave. But when stomach cancer returned in 1979, he understood that The Shootist had been his final farewell. Looking back, the film was like a mirror placed before Wayne, forcing him to face the ending his entire career had avoided. The Shootist is therefore not just a story about the death of an old gunslinger. It is the moment John Wayne allowed the audience to see his true self, weary and fragile, but still maintaining his dignity until the very end. And it is this honesty that makes the film one of the most haunting farewells in Hollywood history. Wayne was conservative but not simplistic. He had personal relationships with many presidents, accepted political defeat, and maintained a spirit of respect for the establishment. This shows that he was not just a one-dimensional propaganda icon in The Man Who Shot Liberty. Valance John Wayne plays an arrogant, sarcastic, conceited, and selfish man who believes he can take whatever he wants. With his large stature, contemptuous laugh, and habit of bullying the weak, this character is both frightening and ambiguous, even irritating at times. Although he ultimately does the right thing at the crucial moment, it is his stubbornness and excessive ego that cause him to lose his lover and his family and end his life in solitude. This is a rare role for John Wayne, a deeply flawed man who still elicits sympathy, something only he could convey so fully. In The Searchers, John Wayne plays Ethan Edwards, a dark, hateful, and prejudiced character obsessed with finding his granddaughter who was kidnapped by the Comanche. A former Confederate soldier, Ethan is bitter, conservative, and cruel, willing to commit barbaric acts and even kill his own granddaughter when he learns she has assimilated with the natives. Although he ultimately chooses the right path, the final scene shows Ethan standing outside his family's door, walking alone towards the frontier, emphasizing the tragedy of a man who never truly belongs in normal society. This is perhaps the role closest to an antagonist in John Wayne's career, frightening, unpredictable, powerful, and used and discarded by society. John Wayne entered American film history as the embodiment of strength, courage, and classic heroism. On screen, he was always the man who knew he was right, knew which side he was on, and never hesitated when it came to making decisions. This image was repeated for decades to the point that many audiences believed it to be Wayne's true self. But behind the tall stature and deep voice was a much more complex person, someone who embodied admirable values but also left behind some hard-to-ignore cracks. Few people knew that Wayne always lived under the pressure of never being allowed to show weakness. From a very early age, he forced himself to become the perfect symbol of masculinity, not only on screen, but also in real life. This meant he rarely allowed himself to show fear, hurt, or regret. Those close to him say that Wayne very rarely spoke about his true feelings, even when faced with illness or family crises. This silence was not because he lacked emotions, but because he feared undermining the image the world had placed upon him. The biggest controversies surrounding Wayne stemmed from his political and social views. In a rapidly changing era, Wayne clung to old beliefs, sometimes to the point of rigidity. These statements and stances led to heavy criticism in later decades when social values had shifted. What is less fairly recognized is that Wayne did not deliberately provoke or seek conflict. He was simply trapped in a worldview he believed had helped him survive. That does not absolve him of responsibility, but it helps us understand the origins of those mistakes. In his later years, when illness forced him to slow down, Wayne became more aware of the gap between his image and his true self. The Shootist was not only his final role, but also a rare moment when he allowed the audience to see his weariness, fragility, and fear of being forgotten. Some relatives recounted that Wayne had become quieter and less judgmental, as if he were learning to look back on himself, even though it was too late to change anything. John Wayne's legacy is therefore not a perfect statue, but a mirror reflecting the complexity of a man who lived too long in the limelight. He showed that glory can protect, but it can also isolate. That becoming an icon sometimes means losing the right to be wrong, to be weak, to make mistakes in a normal way. And precisely because that legacy cannot be encapsulated in a single color, John Wayne is still debated not because he has been forgotten, but because he still forces us to think. What do you think about the mysteries of John Wayne that have been hidden for all these years? I believe some people know his secrets but have never revealed them. If you are one of those holding the secret, please leave your thoughts in the comments below. Support us by liking the video and stay tuned for more revelations about Hollywood stars.